On August 17, 2018, under a white evidence tent beside Forest Road 480 on the Ojo Redondo side of the Zuni Mountains in Cibola National Forest, a county investigator watched a dead man laid out on a steel table hauled in by pickup. The body was Owen Pike, 24, missing since the previous night. He had no cuts, no bruises, no broken nails, no trace of animal damage. His boots stood side by side 6 feet away, clean, laced, toes pointed toward the timber as if someone had removed them with care and set them down for him to step back into. By the end of that week, 3 of the 5 people who entered that section of mountain were dead. The county would later write exposure, panic, and cardiac failure. That explanation was wrong before the ink dried. The air that morning was 58 degrees. Owen's shirt had been folded into a square and placed on a stump. The medic who first touched his throat said the skin was cool, but the jaw had not locked the way it should have. At autopsy, there was no toxin, no stroke, no clot, no trauma, and no disease process that could explain why a healthy man's heart had stopped in open timber with both feet bare on damp soil. The medical examiner told me there was nothing in the body that matched the scene, and nothing in the scene that matched the body. You really have to hear what this team encountered. I can promise you this much. When it is over, the lie in the official file will sound less comforting than the truth. The date was August 14th, 2018. The place was the Zuni Mountains of western New Mexico, southwest of Mount Sedgwick, 46 road miles from the nearest emergency room with overnight staff. 3 dead. 2 of us came back. 1 of us did not come back whole. What comes next is the account. My name is Eli Yatsattie. I was 39 years old then. I had worked 14 years as a wildlife officer assigned to joint tribal and federal field operations in western New Mexico. And I had spent most of my life in and around those mountains. My grandfather cut deadfall there in winter. My mother gathered pinon below the ridges when the season was good. I knew the smell of wet ponderosa bark after rain, knew how the light thinned under Douglas fir, knew where the old logging grade still ran straight through newer growth like scars that refused to fade. Nothing had ever frightened me. That changed at the Zuni Mountains. We were a 5-person survey crew assigned to document storm damage and erosion around an older ceremonial-adjacent area near a neglected service cabin above a meadow on the Ojo Redondo side. Dana Mercer led the operation. She was 44, a federal archaeologist with 19 years in compliance work, exact in speech, careful with paperwork, the kind of person who measured before she breathed. Luis Ortega was 31, our medic and drone operator, with 7 years in backcountry response. Luis was quiet, neat with his hands, and always the first to notice when equipment sounded wrong before it failed. Ben Setlikai was 52, local tracker, pack hand, and the only man I knew who could look at broken grass and tell you which way an animal had turned 10 minutes earlier. Ben had 26 years in the field and a dry way of speaking that made even a warning sound practical. Owen Pike was the newest man with us, 24, 1 year into contract field work, broad-shouldered, eager, and too ready to prove he could carry more than the next person. I was there because the access roads crossed land under mixed concern, because storm runoff had cut through an old site boundary, and because Dana wanted somebody who knew the forest and the local people well enough to keep the operation smooth. We drove in with 1 truck, 1 utility trailer, 2 satellite phones, 6 handheld radios, a drone case, medical kit, 5 days of water, and enough food for 4 if the roads washed out. Donna said we would be in and out in 2 nights. Ben looked at the sky and said nothing. The ground there rises and folds in a way maps do not explain. Ponderosa stands give way to fir and aspen. Old cuts from the logging years open without warning into meadow strips bright enough to hurt your eyes after a half-mile in shade. Volcanic stone pushes through the soil in shelves and low black shoulders. The cabin sat above one of those meadow breaks, with a narrow drainage dropping off behind it, thick with downed timber and young growth. That drainage mattered. It carried sound. A voice spoken low at the bottom could slide uphill and reach the cabin wall thin and clear, while a man standing 30 yards off to your left could sound far away. Wilderness pressed on all sides. Once the truck was parked, every road out felt borrowed. Before we left, an elder from home stopped me outside the office. He knew where we were going before I said it. He told me not to stay after dark if the insects went quiet all at once. He told me not to answer if I heard someone I knew calling from uphill when I could see that person standing beside me. I said we were doing a 2-day survey, not a winter story. He said, "That country was old before roads, Eli." Then he handed me a small pouch of white ash wrapped in cloth. I put it in my pocket because refusing would have been rude. I did not believe I would use it. We reached the cabin just after noon on August 14th. The structure leaned a little south and smelled of mouse droppings, wet wood, and cold stone. Dana set sectors. Luis checked batteries. Owen hauled cases to the porch 2 at a time because he wanted everyone to see he could. Ben stood at the meadow edge, looking into the tree line long enough that I walked over and stood beside him. He pointed with his chin toward the drainage. "No birds," he said. I listened. He was right. No jays, no chipmunks, no insect whine. The silence did not arrive by degrees. It was there the way a light is either on or off. We spent the afternoon flagging wash lines and photographing exposed ground. Near a band of black rock above the drainage, Luis found prints in damp soil under a seam of shade. They were not clear enough to lift. They were deep enough to matter. Each impression ran in a straight line toward the meadow. Then they stopped. Not faded out. Stopped. The last one was full and clean, heel and forefoot both. There was no turn, no drag, no second line stepping away. Owen stood over them grinning, until he saw none of us were. Dana said it was erosion, bad light, bad expectations. Ben did not argue. He only looked at the trees, as if waiting for something there to acknowledge us. At 4:16 p.m., one of Luis's trail cameras froze for 11 minutes. The timestamp jumped. The battery rating held steady. The lens showed the same slice of meadow, but the grass changed position between frames as if wind had blown and time had passed inside a gap the device refused to record. While Luis worked on that, Owen said he heard Ben calling from the lower drainage. Ben was standing 20 feet away, drinking from a bottle and wiping sweat off his chin. Owen laughed once, the way people laugh when they want to make their own skin settle down. Then he went pale. He said, "No." I heard him again. He started downhill before I could catch his arm. We followed at once. Owen moved through the trees like he was late to something. He kept saying, "I'm here," to a voice only he could hear. By the time we cut across the drainage, he was gone. There was no crash through brush, no stumbling track, no cry. We found his hat first, then his overshirt, folded flat on a stump. 50 yards farther on, his boots stood together in a patch of needles, heels touching. Luis called his name until his voice broke rough at the edges. Donna ordered a line search. Ben said we needed to get back to the cabin before dark. Donna said nobody was leaving without Owen. That was the first choice the mountain punished. At dusk, the woods went silent again. Completely. The kind of silence that presses on your teeth. Our radios had worked all afternoon. At 7:03, they started hissing in clipped bursts, then cut to dead static the moment the last insect noise went out. Luis launched the drone above the meadow for thermal sweep. It rose 10 feet, steadied, then yawed hard to the right, as if something had struck one rotor, though nothing touched it. On the controller screen, a long dark column moved between the trees where there should have been cooler, broken shapes. I looked up and saw only trunks and the failing light between them. Then, across the meadow, I heard my mother's voice say my name. She had been dead 6 years. We got back to the cabin with daylight draining off the boards. Donna barred the door with a shovel handle. Ben checked every window twice. Luis laid out the med kit, water, flare gun, and one old pump shotgun the cabin host had left locked in a rusted metal box with 6 shells that might or might not fire. We counted batteries out loud. We counted radio charge levels. We counted our own breathing after a while, because that was easier than admitting we were waiting for the next sound. When it came, it was not a knock. It was Owen's voice from outside the rear wall, calm and level, saying, "I found the truck. Come around back." Ben put his hand over Luis's mouth before he could answer. Then Ben took the white ash from my pocket, made a thin line across the back threshold, and told us not to step over it no matter who called. He said it in the same tone a man might use when telling you to keep gasoline off a flame. Practical, bare, as if the rule had been tested before. Owen called again. This time he sounded tired. Then he sounded like Dana's brother, though none of us had heard that man speak. Then the voice moved, not through the brush, not with footsteps, but from one wall to the next, circling the cabin at a speed no person could manage in full dark over broken ground without stumbling once. At first light, we found Owen 40 yards uphill, seated with his back against a fir as if someone had arranged him for a photograph. His eyes were open. His skin was gray around the mouth. There were no wounds, no dirt under his nails, no sign that he had run. I touched his wrist and felt the cold there. Luis examined him and kept shaking his head like a man trying to clear water from one ear. He told me the pupils were wrong for the hour of death and the jaw was wrong for the night temperature. Dana said we were packing out. Then she saw marks on the basalt ledge beyond Owen's body and changed her mind. The marks were older than the cabin and older than the old logging road. Lichen had grown across some of them. Others had been cut deeper later by a different hand. Spirals. A line of figures without faces. One taller form at the edge of each cluster. Ben said he had seen the pattern before in a different draw farther east. Always near a break in the trees, and always near old stories nobody wanted written down by outsiders. Dana took photographs, said this was why we could not leave yet. A federal site meant documentation. She believed the mountain had given her evidence, and that belief made her less careful than Owen had been. By late afternoon, we found more proof that this had happened before. Inside the cabin stove box, wrapped in wax paper that had gone yellow with age, Luis found a notebook page dated July 22nd, 1974. The signature was Garrett Vale, Forest Service Seasonal. The line I remember said, "Heard Hollis outside after dark, though Hollis had not returned from town. Collins went to him. We found Collins dead at dawn without a mark." Another line lower down read, "The old man from Zuni told us not to answer if the mountain used our own." Donna read that twice, then folded the page and said coincidence had started doing too much work in that cabin. The second night was worse, because by then it had learned us. The silence came earlier. Luis sent the drone up before dark. It reached 30 feet, turned toward the drainage on its own, and dropped straight down behind the cabin, with a sound like a plate breaking. Dana ran after it before either of us could stop her. That was the distraction. We heard the crash to our left and her voice to our right at the same time, saying she had found tracks near the meadow. Ben swore once under his breath and told us not to split. Dana was already past the porch rail, moving into the timber with her light, low and fast. We followed her beam for maybe 10 seconds. Then we lost it. No stumble, no cry, just absence. We found her near midnight, where the meadow narrowed back into trees. Her field notebook lay open beside one hand. Her flashlight was still on. Dana Mercer, who had spent 19 years refusing to believe in anything she could not document, was lying on her back with her eyes half open and no injury any of us could name. Her radio had died at 9:14 p.m. Luis checked his watch and said his own watch had stopped for 2 minutes at the same time. The air smelled like wet stone and cold ashes. I remember looking up and seeing something pass between two trunks against the dark, not a shape I can hand to you cleanly, only height where there should have been space and a stride that covered too much ground between one tree and the next. Back at the cabin, Ben stopped holding things back. He said the elders used an old Aishiwi name for it, that he would not speak in full outside winter telling, then translated it for Luis as the one that walks where light fails. He said it did not feed the way an animal feeds. It took the part of a person that animates the body and left the shell behind. He said it chose, never random, never all at once. He said the rule was older than the cabin, older than the survey markers, maybe older than the clans that first learned where not to camp. If it used a known voice, you did not answer. If the ash line broke, you remade it. If it called from the trees, you stayed where the living could see you. He also told us it had a pattern. In 1951, 2 sheepmen were found in the same sector, one dead without injury, one wandering with his clothes removed and folded on a rock. In 1974, Collins died, as Garrett Vale described. In 1998, a volunteer firefighter from Gallup was recovered near the drainage after hearing his daughter calling from timber while she slept at home. In 2011, a hunter was found barefoot with no external trauma and no medical explanation beyond a phrase on the county sheet that read, "probable cardiac event." 4 deaths across 4 decades in the same pocket of mountain, all within a few miles of that meadow. 2 who survived those earlier events died years later of unexplained heart failure, though both had passed physicals months before. The 3rd night began with rain that never reached us. We heard it moving across the trees uphill, soft and steady, while the air around the cabin stayed dry. Luis loaded the shotgun. 2 shells misfed. We had 4. He set road flares by the porch and windows. Ben drew a wider line of ash around the threshold and told us to keep the circle closed if anything happened to him. That line stayed in my head because of the way he said it. Not hopeful, not resigned, like a man placing a final tool where it needed to be before dark. An hour after full black, something struck the south wall once, hard enough to shake dust from the rafters. Then came my sister's voice from outside, laughing the way she used to when we were children. I did not answer. Luis gripped the shotgun so hard the tendons in his wrist stood out white. Ben stood at the back window and listened. The 2nd strike hit the front porch post. The 3rd came from under us, from the crawl space, as if a person could flatten and move under the floor without displacing stone. Then Ben said very softly, "It wants one more." A handprint appeared on the window glass from the outside. Not mud, not water. A darker absence, as if the glass had been touched by colder night than the air held. I looked past it and got the clearest view I ever had. Shoulders higher than the sill, limbs too long in proportion, and a face that never settled long enough in my eyes to become a face. The rear latch lifted by itself. The ash line at the threshold stirred, though there was no wind. Ben moved before I understood what he was doing. He kicked the doors shut, shoved me back inside the room, and stepped over the line to the porch. Luis grabbed my arm hard enough to bruise and told me not to break the circle. Ben turned his head once and said, "Do not follow my voice." Then he went down the steps into the dark. We heard movement all around the cabin at once. Porch boards, needles, the scrape of bark. Ben's voice came from the meadow, saying he had reached the truck. Then from the drainage, saying he had found Dana alive. Then from directly beside me at the window, though the glass showed only my own reflection. I kept my mouth shut until I tasted blood where I had bitten my tongue. At dawn, Ben was gone. In the meadow, we found his knife, his hat, and a small turquoise bead he wore tied inside his shirt for luck. The grass around those things lay flat in a rough ring. There were tracks leading in from the trees, long impressions deeper than a man's step should be, and then the same impossible ending we had seen before. The final print complete and clean, followed by nothing. No return line, no drag, no branch spring, nothing. Luis stood with a shotgun hanging loose in his hand and said, "It left us." That was when I understood the ugliest part. We had not escaped. We had been allowed to leave. The official machinery took over from there. Search teams came. Dogs would not enter the drainage after the first 100 yards. A helicopter sweep found nothing. Donna and Owen went to the county examiner. Cause of death: undetermined. With the report language later pressured into exposure-related cardiac events, despite weather records that made exposure absurd and autopsy notes that described no pathway to that conclusion. Ben was listed as missing, presumed lost in wilderness terrain, though the meadow where his things were found showed no sign of panic, no torn clothing, no blood, and no route a human body could have taken without leaving some plain physical answer behind. The official report was wrong in every place where it mattered. I know that because Luis and I kept looking after we were told not to. We pulled county summaries, old ranger logs, clipped news briefs from Gallup and Grants, and a library box of uncatalogued field correspondence that should have been destroyed, but was not. Between 1951 and 2018, there were 7 deaths and 3 disappearances in that same section of mountain with repeating details. Clothing set down neatly, silence before the event, voices imitating known people, and medical findings that failed to explain healthy bodies simply stopping. I still have photocopies. I still keep them in separate folders, never stacked, because I do not like touching the pages in the same order twice. I have not slept in an upstairs room since that week. I check each door lock 3 times before bed, even in houses with no porch. Months later, I went back to the elder who had warned me. He listened without interrupting. Then he took a folded note from a tobacco tin and handed it to me. Ben had left it with him the day before our survey. The note was written in blue ink on lined paper torn from a legal pad. It said, "If the mountain uses me, do not answer. If Eli comes back, tell him this was not the first time it watched him." The elder told me survivors were not always spared. Sometimes they were marked and left to carry the account until the account had been told enough times to be ignored. Then the heart stopped years later in a grocery line or at a kitchen sink, and the doctor wrote natural causes. The Zuni Mountains are open to the public today. Families still camp there. Riders still use the trails. People still picnic in the pines and watch afternoon light move across the meadows and drive home with photographs and a cooler in the back seat. And for almost all of them, the mountains remain exactly what they appear to be. High forest, clean air, old stone, a place to walk and come back from. That is how the pattern stays hidden. Each case gets filed alone. Each body gets explained alone. Nobody lays the pages side by side long enough to see the same silence moving through all of them. If you ever go there, remember the condition that matters. Not fog, not full moon, not winter. The nights to watch are the still ones after summer rain has passed nearby, but not over you. When the ground smells wet uphill, the insects cut out all at once, and a familiar voice carries from the timber with no wind to carry it. If that happens, do not answer. Do not step off the lit ground. Do not follow a person you cannot see clearly with your own eyes. If you find boots placed neatly where no one would leave them, turn around and leave before dark. I survived because it wanted a witness. That is the part that keeps me awake at night.